Rome, an empire built on the strength of its legions and the cunning of its leaders, seemed unstoppable. But what if I told you that more than the bloody battles fought on the battlefield, Roman power was weakened by treacherous alliances and diplomatic games? While Rome relied on its military superiority, its biggest enemies were lurking, not with swords, but with smiles and promises of peace. You might think of barbarian tribes as nothing more than wild hordes, ready to strike. But what if those very tribes used friendship agreements to slip past Rome's defenses? Carefully planned betrayals, alliances that, instead of strengthening, were slowly eating away at the empire from within. How did these barbarian leaders manipulate Rome, gaining time and territory? Today, we're going to dive into the subtle and treacherous strategies that help bring down one of the greatest empires in history. Stay tuned, because what you're about to discover reveals a little-known side of Rome's fall. Let's get started. From the earliest days of its expansion, Rome grew accustomed to viewing everything beyond its borders with suspicion. For the Romans, the world was split between their civilized empire and the barbarian hordes living in wild, inhospitable regions. However, the situation was far more complex than just battles between civilization and savagery. As Rome pushed forward, barbarian tribes didn't just rely on brute force. They watched, they learned, and in many cases, they chose a more subtle approach to deal with the Romans. The idea that barbarians were simply fierce enemies began to change. Some tribes realized that the most effective strategy wasn't direct confrontation, but diplomacy, which could secure advantages. The Romans, in turn, saw these alliances as a way to maintain peace on the borders, offering protection and benefits in exchange for loyalty. But this so-called friendship was fragile. The Romans believed they were in control, yet many times, they were the ones being manipulated by the tribes. This diplomatic interaction was never free of suspicion, though. For many barbarian leaders, alliances were merely temporary, a strategy to buy time until a better opportunity presented itself. Rome, confident in its military might and its ability to dominate through culture and politics, often underestimated how these tribes could use diplomacy as a weapon. The empire, so used to winning battles in the field, failed to see the silent war unfolding behind the scenes. At the heart of these alliances was a constant exchange of power and influence. Rome offered benefits like citizenship, land, and wealth in return for the supposed loyalty of the tribes. Yet while the Romans believed they were strengthening their borders, the barbarians were laying the groundwork to weaken the empire from within. Roman politics, so complex and proud, failed to recognize the real threat these alliances represented. The barbarians, on the other hand, began mastering the art of political manipulation. They watched how the Romans moved and made decisions, then used that knowledge to their advantage. Tribes like the Visigoths, Ostrogoths, and Vandals understood that Rome could be defeated not just by the strength of arms, but by cunning. Alliances, rather than being pacts of peace, often turned into tools to undermine Roman power. As the barbarian tribes gained Rome's trust, they began using this proximity to their advantage, turning alliances that were initially beneficial to the empire into true traps. A notable example is the case of the Visigoths, who initially sought refuge within Roman borders to escape the Huns. Rome, seeing an opportunity to turn enemies into allies, accepted their request. However, the relationship quickly soured when the empire failed to deliver on its promises. The Visigoths' dissatisfaction grew until, led by Alaric, they turned against Rome, culminating in the sack of the city in 410 AD, one of the most significant events in the empire's history. What began as a diplomatic agreement became a catastrophic breach in Rome's defenses. The empire, in its arrogance, didn't foresee that its unkept promises would come back to haunt it in such a violent way. The alliance, which once seemed like a practical solution, turned into a deadly trap. The Vandals were another tribe that followed a similar path. Initially, they were allowed to settle within the empire, but like the Visigoths, they soon grew disillusioned with Rome. Seizing on the empire's weakness and lack of cohesion, the Vandals began to expand their territory, eventually crossing the Mediterranean to sack Rome's African province, one of the richest and most vital regions of the empire. In this case, diplomacy was merely a prelude to betrayal. These betrayals highlighted Rome's growing inability to handle the barbarian tribes. Each failed alliance strengthened the barbarians and eroded internal trust in Rome's political system. The empire's foreign policy, once based on strength, now appeared vulnerable. Every new tribe that Rome tried to subjugate or ally with brought a fresh risk of betrayal, a pattern that played out repeatedly in the empire's final centuries. In the end, these treacherous alliances revealed a bitter truth. Rome was no longer the unstoppable power it once was. The barbarian tribes, once seen as nothing more than brutish enemies, had become masters of treacherous diplomacy. The empire, in trying to use these agreements to its advantage, found itself ensnared in a game it didn't know how to play, underestimating its adversaries and overestimating its own ability to control them. The barbarian tribes weren't just skilled in the use of force. They also showed a surprising ability to manipulate the rules of Rome's political game. Over time, barbarian leaders realized they could use the empire's bureaucracy and internal intrigues to their advantage. The tribes began sending envoys and forging treaties that appeared to strengthen peace but were, in reality, slowly and deliberately undermining Rome's defenses and resources. The key to this strategy lay in exploiting the empire's internal decay. Rome, already weakened by political, economic, and social issues, struggled to keep a close watch on all fronts. Barbarian leaders like Alaric of the Visigoths and Gaiseric of the Vandals knew how to capitalize on Rome's internal weaknesses, often presenting themselves as saviors or reliable allies. Behind the promises of loyalty, however, was the ambition to weaken Rome from within, using its own political structure. The critical point of this manipulation was the fragmentation of power within the empire. Rome was split between East and West, and the internal rivalries between Roman rulers and generals made barbarian diplomacy even more effective. On several occasions, barbarian leaders backed one side against the other in Roman internal disputes, only to later betray both. The ability to manipulate these internal conflicts gave the barbarians an edge that Rome, with all its diplomatic experience, failed to foresee. Furthermore, the manipulation wasn't limited to direct betrayals. Often, the barbarian tribes negotiated deals that allowed them to settle within Roman borders, receiving land and resources. However, instead of strengthening the empire's defenses, these concessions paved the way for barbarians to establish permanent bases, poised for future invasions. It was a dangerous game, in which Rome believed it was in control, but in reality, it was caught in a cycle of concessions that continually weakened it. Over time, it became clear that the barbarians had mastered the art of manipulating Rome. The empire, which once dictated the rules, now found itself playing by its enemy's game. Instead of using diplomacy to maintain peace, Rome was being outmaneuvered by those quietly preparing for its downfall. The barbarians didn't just become masters of Roman diplomacy, they also proved that the empire was far from invulnerable. Over the centuries, betrayal became a recurring pattern in Rome's dealings with the barbarian tribes. As barbarian leaders grew more cunning, their tactics of betrayal evolved from simple acts of disloyalty to strategic blows that deeply shook the foundations of the empire. Each broken alliance and violated treaty represented a new wound in the Roman giant, which began to buckle under the weight of its own overconfidence. One of the most emblematic cases of orchestrated betrayal was the Vandal invasion of Africa, led by Gaiseric. Initially welcomed as allies, the Vandals quickly took advantage of internal instability and Rome's unfulfilled promises. During his campaign, Gaiseric not only sacked Carthage but also transformed the African province into an independent kingdom, depriving Rome of one of its richest sources of grain and taxes. This betrayal was a blow from which the empire never fully recovered. Another example that highlighted the empire's vulnerability to such betrayals was the Visigoth siege of Rome in 410 AD. Alaric, the Gothic leader, had been a loyal ally to the Romans, even serving in their army. However, After repeated frustrations with Roman politics and the mistreatment of his people, he turned against the city. The fall of Rome to the Visigoths shocked the ancient world, showing that the empire no longer had control, even over its own capital. These betrayals weren't just direct attacks, but part of a much larger game. The barbarian tribes, far from being mere irrational enemies, were involved in a web of intrigue that transcended the empire's borders. They knew when and how to strike, making the most of Rome's internal crises. While the empire struggled to maintain its defenses, the barbarians played the political game with a level of sophistication the Romans never expected. What once seemed unthinkable, the idea that inferior tribes could defeat Rome, started to become a reality through a series of calculated betrayals. Rome's once feared military power now proved insufficient in the face of a threat that came from within. In trying to maintain control over these barbarian peoples through alliances and diplomacy, Rome ultimately became just another pawn in their enemy's game.